Yes. Okay. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is this. I want to draw a circle. And mine's probably going to look like an egg. There you go. Draw a circle. You have a circle? Why isn't it on mine? Yeah, that's what happened. All right. You are babies. Okay. So on the circle, okay, shh. On the circle. Yesterday we already found this was my x value, and this is my y value, and this is the radius. So the x value, the y value, and the radius. So from geometry, I know you remember the SOHCAHTOA, right? You don't know what it is? Okay. So what does the S in SOHCAHTOA stand for? Sine, opposite over hypotenuse. Sine, cut, sit. Sit or cut? You're done? You're faster than they were. Okay, so was sine, which is opposite over hypotenuse. Cosine, adjacent over hypotenuse. And TOA, tangent, is opposite over adjacent. Okay, so that's okay, but you have to pay attention to what I'm about to do now, okay? So the SOHCAHTOA helps you remember the sides, and that's all you need to remember, but we're going to go from the beginning. So the cosine, SOHCA, so that's opposite over, adjacent over hypotenuse. Yes, K. Adjacent over the hypotenuse. So that's where I get the x over the r, right? The sine is the opposite over the hypotenuse, and the cosine is the opposite over the adjacent. Okay? Now, I just want to look at these to start with. On the unit circle, what is the radius equal? 1. So if I replace all the r's with 1, what is the cosine equal? It just equals x, right? So it's just the x value. And the sine is just going to equal the y value. And the tangent is the y over the x, but if I have an x value and a y value, I can find that, correct? So this is probably the part that's new for you. And you probably saw these, but you need to know the reciprocals. So cosine and the secant are reciprocals. So the cosine is x over r. The secant is just flipped. All right? The sine and the cosecant are reciprocals, and they're flipped. And the tangent and the cotangent are reciprocals, and they're flipped. Okay? So we said then that I replaced my radius with 1. So the cosine and the sine just become x and y. The tangent doesn't change. If these are reciprocals, then x over 1, when I flip it, becomes 1 over x. Okay? The sine, when I flip, becomes 1 over y. And all I did to get from the tangent to the cotangent is flip the x and the y. So does this make sense? Everybody's okay with this? Okay. So on your unit circle, off to one side on the little unit circle. You're going to want to write the cosine is the x, the sine is the y, and the tangent is the y over the x. Just anywhere you want to. Just so you know where it is, so you remember. I didn't stutter, baby. So write the sine, the cosine, and the tangent. Thank you, Jordan. Did you write what I told you to write? Write it. Yes. No. Okay. Okay. So the next thing you need to know, we've already talked about yesterday, and we put this on the circle already. In quadrant 1, the x is positive and the y is positive. In quadrant 2, the x is negative and the y is positive. Quadrant 3, we have negative and negative, and then a positive and a negative. Okay? So that's going to affect our trig ratios. Okay? All right. So pay attention now. All right? And Jordan, you have to sit and listen, okay? I'm going to start, you guys, and you need to listen to all of my words. Listen. So, to start, the sine of 90 degrees. So we already talked about the sine, is it x or y? It's y. And let me help you, Mikey. Cosine is before sine, right? So x is before y. Cosine is x, sine is y. Okay? Just go alphabetical order with that. So cosine goes with x and sine goes with y. So if I'm doing the sine, I want the y value at 90. So at 90, oh. All right, that was cool. Okay, so the way I always start this is I sketch myself a little graph because I want to see where this is going to go. You, stop moving the mouse. You do. Okay, so this is 90. That's to start with. It's a quadrangle, and so I know that here I have 0 and 1. So the sine of 90 is the y value, so this equals 1. So the cosine of 3 pi over 2. So if I do this, 3 pi over 2, I know my values down here are 0 and negative 1. The cosine is 0. Okay, so the tangent of pi. So here's pi. I know the x and y value at pi are negative 1 and 0. So tangent is sine over cosine. Is that correct? Sine over cosine, so it's y over x. So So I get 0 over negative 1, which is 0. So now I'm going to do the secant of 270. So the first thing you're going to do before we start is this. Here's 270. I know that. What's my point at 270? 0 and negative 1. So the secant, what is it the inverse of? So take a look. What is the secant? So it's 1 over x. So it's the inverse of the cosine of 270, right? So this is 1 over 0. Can I do that? Can you have a 0 in the denominator, friends? No, this is undefined. Yes. Okay. So first of all, this one, I have a negative 3 pi over 2. So which way is that going? I'm going this way, which means I'm going to end up right here. I know the point here is 0 and positive 1. Cosecant is the inverse of sine, so that means it's 1 over y, which equals 1. So anytime it's a quadrantal, this is what you're going to do. And quadrantal means it's on the axis. Okay? So everybody's good with this. Okay, so let's move on. Hey, tell your dad, what are you in charge of?
He took my phone.
It's perfect. Good job. Good job. All right. So the next thing, from your cute little unit circle that we did, if you'll fill these in, the 30, 45, and 60. All of you should be writing. Like, pick up your cute unit circle and fill these in. I don't think we're having as much fun today as we had yesterday. What do you think? Okay. Okay. Everybody watch. So I want the cosine of 5 pi over 6. And let's say you don't have your handy-dandy, beautiful foldable that I made, okay? You may not. It will be sad, but there may come a time you don't have it, like a test. All right, so cosine of 5 pi over 6. First of all, the reference angle is always in the problem already. So pi over 6 is my reference angle, okay? So we use this symbol for the reference angle. It's a fish or a gamma, either one. So this is my reference angle. So I'm looking for cosine. So what is the cosine of pi over 6? Which one of these is pi over 6? So, yeah, this is a hint. Pi over 3, pi over 4, pi over 6. So I'm looking for cosine, which is the x value. So my x value is the square root of 3 over 2. Now you have to look at 5 pi over 6. So pi over 6 is 30 times 5 is 150. So that's going here, correct? So I drew a sketch of which quadrant 5 pi over 6 would be in. It's in the second quadrant. Is x positive or negative? It's negative, so the cosine is a negative square root of 3 over 2. And that's it. We're going to do more. You take the reference angle, you find the value, figure out which quadrant it is, and change the sign. So number 2, 315. First of all, 315 has a 5 in it, so I know it's a 45, right? It has to be 45. So my reference angle is going to be pi over 4. I want the tangent of pi over 4. The tangent is sine over cosine. So I'm going to take the square root of 2 over 2 divided by the square root of 2 over 2. So how do I do that? I'm going to flip the bottom one and multiply. So I'm going to take the square root of 2 over 2 times 2 over the square root of 2. So what happens? Everything cancels and it leaves me with 1. So now I have to decide which quadrant is 315 in. 315 is in this quadrant. So if I look at my value here, the x is positive, but the y is negative, so my answer has to be negative. So you have to start with the reference angle, you find the value, and then you have to decide whether it's positive or negative. So let's do another one. What's my reference angle here? So it's pi over 3, which is 60 degrees. So the first thing I have to know, what is secant the inverse for? Secant is for cosine, right? So I want the cosine of pi over 3, which means I want the x value of pi over 3. What is the x value of pi over 3? None of them are 1/3. It's a half. So the next thing I want to do is 2 pi over 3. Where is 2 pi over 3? So if pi over 3 is 60, 2 times 60 is 120, which means it's in the second quadrant. What's negative in the second quadrant? So is this my x value? It is, so I have to make it negative. And I want the secant, so what do I have to do? Flip it. So it's a negative, and the 1/2 becomes bless you. The sine of 330. First of all, I know 330 is over here. If it's 330, my reference angle is 30 degrees. And 30 degrees would be pi over 6. So my reference angle is pi over 6. So the sine of pi over 6, What's the sign of pi over 6? So I want the y value at pi over 6. It's 1/2. And then you have to look in the third quadrant. What's negative? X or y? Y. So the sign of 330 is a negative 1/2. What's the reference angle, Rommel? Look at it. All right, so the reference angle is pi over 3. What's tangent? Sine over cosine, right? Sine over cosine. So I want the y value on top and the x value on bottom. So what's the y value at pi over 3? Y value. Y value at 60. It's a half? So it's square root of 3 over 2. And then the x value for the sine of pi over 6 should be a half. And how do I do this? Do you guys have this right? Y over x. Yes, okay. So I'm dividing, so I'm going to flip it and multiply. So this is going to be the square root of 3 over 2 times 2 over 1. So this is the square root of 3. So the next thing I need, oh, this is sine over cosine. Okay. The next thing I need 2 pi over 3. So pi over 3 is 60 times 2 gives me 120. So it's here. So I end up with a negative x and a positive y, which means this has to be negative. Okay, you all do the next one.
Wait, what?
You were listening the whole
Hey, you go do the next problem.
Do you hear this, Jordan? Do you hear my problem here? Can you do it? Most of it? Some of it? You cannot do this with your head down.